Hi there, I'm Scott, and this is GreatScott Knitting Dyes Yarn Episode 7. With this episode, I'm marking a small but personally significant milestone. I now have over 100 subscribers to my YouTube channel. I want to thank you all for taking time to watch my yarn dyeing journey. I hope you have found it entertaining and informative. If you are a returning viewer, I thank you for continuing to watch. And if you are new to this post, thank you for checking it out. I hope you like it. Today I will be dyeing two skeins of Dyer Supplier 7525 Merino Nylon Fingering Yarn. That is a 75% superwash merino wool and 25% nylon. It is South American sourcing, spun in Italy with about 415 yards, and it is a 3-ply yarn. For my dye, I will be using some homemade sugar sprinkles that I created using plain granulated sugar and Wilton's concentrated food color. The technique I'll be using will be low immersion and speckling. To start things off, I do want to show you how I made my homemade sugar sprinkles using granulated sugar and food color. I will be using the Wilton Color Right concentrated food color and about 1 tablespoon of granulated sugar. Now I'm going to be mixing a green sugar sprinkles using Wilton's blue and Wilton's orange. I don't want it to be a bright green, I want it to be a little earthier. I like to use old medicine bottles to do this mixing because it keeps the sugar in a concentrated area and it makes it easier to get the dye mixed up into the sugar. So I'm going to add 2 drops of the Wilton's orange and 1 drop of the Wilton's blue. I'll then just take a metal straw and just begin stirring it up in the old medicine bottle. This allows me to easily use the sides of the medicine bottle to work the color into the sugar itself. Once that sugar has been well mixed, I like to dump it out into a small shallow dish so that the sugar can dry a little bit. There is a level of moisture here, so you do want to allow it to dry for about 20 minutes. This is my first experiment in drawing my color inspiration from a photograph. With August drawing to a close and the weather slowly starting to turn cooler, my thoughts have been towards fall and fall colors. This photograph is called Autumn in the Tall Grass. It is by Brad Mangus, and it is a photograph of the Kansas Flint Hills in November. Definitely inspires me to use some browns, some speckles of red and green, yellows, and some oranges. I have my yarn skeins soaking in some tap water of about 8 cups with, I believe, 2 tablespoons of vinegar to get it prepared for dyeing the yarn. My plan for the first skein is to first give it a tonal wash across the entire skein of yarn of browns and tans. So I'm going to begin by mixing some base color of about 4 drops of the brown food coloring, which I'll then put into about 8 cups of water with the with some vinegar added to it. Now to dye yarn, you need your protein-based yarn like the wool that I'm dyeing. You need acid like vinegar, and you need your dye, and you need heat. I am going to add this dye to about 8 cups of hot water. This water has already is already at a simmer, and to that I'll put my pre-soaked yarn, which was soaked in a vinegar bath or in vinegar water, and vinegar has been added to this dye pot already. With all of that acid and with the heat already there and the low amount of water, I should get a very tonal colorway on this yarn. So I'm going to go ahead and add that yarn in, moving it around a little bit so that that yarn gets in contact with the dye. But as you can see, that dye is already soaking up into the fiber. Now to get that tonal effect with that high acid content and the heat already there, there's going to be lots of areas that get darker tones and then some areas that may get no dye at all. And so that'll give us that tonal quality. I'll allow this to heat for about 15 minutes to set the color. It's been about 20 minutes, so let's check how our brown tonal base is doing. Using my white bowl, I'm going to check to see if there's any dye left in the water, and it looks like we are clear. And it looks like there are some really nice tan and some medium brown colors in the yarn. So as I pick it up, I'll check out what level of coverage we have. And while this is pretty, it's not quite as complete a base as I would like. There's just a bit too much light and undyed yarn here. So what I am going to do is add another 4 drops of brown food coloring from the Wilton's Colorite system to this dye bath to give us a little more coverage on the yarn and maybe darken up some of those brown areas to get a bit more tonality to this yarn color base. So I'm going to go ahead and arrange. Yeah, that's still pretty warm, so I'm going to use the tongs to put this yarn back into the dye pot with the additional dye. Arrange the yarn around a little bit, especially around that tie. I want to make sure that there's no resists in that area and try and get some of that light color into that brown as well. And with that yarn finally in place, I'll go ahead and cover it and let that yarn color set for about 20 minutes. It's been another 20 minutes, so I'm going to go ahead and check to see how that color base is doing. and if all of the dye has absorbed. I'll use my white bowl test to initially review, and I'm going to call it done in terms of all of that dye having absorbed. And as I pick it up, I can see that some of those areas are a little darker and I have a little better coverage than I had the first time. So I am pleased with this final coverage of the base for my first skein of yarn. So now I'm going to squeeze some of the water out and set it to its side as I prepare this pan for speckle dyeing. I've added a steamer tray to my dye bath, or to my dye pot, and I'm going to arrange my yarn with my base color on this steamer tray so that I can speckle and then steam set each round of speckling before I move on. So I'm just going to arrange to make sure that having trouble sort of arranging my yarn here, but I'm going to arrange it so that I can get sort of the maximum amount of coverage and keep the yarn on my small steam rack. I'm going to begin my first round of speckling using the yellow sugar sprinkles and a sieve. And I'm going to, I had it sort of generously portioned in some places and then just lightly sprinkled in others. As I do my sprinkling, I'm going from lighter colors to darker colors. So I'm starting with that bright yellow. Next, I'll be sprinkling with orange, then red, green, and brown. I'm going to go ahead and steam set the light colors that I just did for about 15 minutes. After that 15 minutes has elapsed, I'm now ready to continue sprinkling this side of the yarn with some of the darker colors. I allowed that steam set just to make sure that there wasn't too much bleeding and mixing over. So now I'm going to go ahead with the green and the brown on this side of the yarn. After that first pass of speckling, here's what that looks like on the yarn. You can really see the specific spots of color that are striking onto the fiber. After steam setting it for about 15 minutes, I'm now ready to go ahead and flip the yarn over and do some speckling on the other side of the yarn. So I will get this yarn flipped over, and oh yeah, notice that it's really hot. Go ahead and flip this yarn over and then do the speckling on this other side. Here's a closer up view of that flip side speckling I just got completed. It will now be time to cover it and let this side steam set for about 15 minutes. It's been about 15 minutes, so now I'm going to check on the progress of our yarn and how this is set. I'm just going to poke some of the areas to see if any of those colors bleed, and that'll help me make sure that those speckles have set in place. And this looks really good. So what I'm going to do now is turn it a few more times to make sure I have some really good coverage on all of the yarn, and then I'll come back when it has I have completed all of the speckling. This skein of yarn is now complete, so I'm going to pull it out of my steamer basket and set it in this bowl to the side to completely cool before I rinse it. Now that my skein of yarn is completely cooled, I'm ready to rinse it and see how we have done in terms of setting the color. So I'm going to be rinsing it in some cool water. And as you can see, there's just some lovely color on this skein of yarn. So let's see if it'll stick. So I'll start by gently just rinsing it in plain tap water to see if there's any initial bleeding. Right now, I am not seeing any color coming out of this skein of yarn. So let's see what happens when we add a little bit of clear dish soap to help rinse out the vinegar. And just this little bit is all we need. So we'll begin just rinsing it in that soapy water. Oftentimes with the addition of a detergent, the dye will begin to bleed a little bit. So let's see where we're at. It doesn't look like there's very much color, if any, coming out of the yarn at this point. Maybe just a hint. I'm now going to rinse the soap out of this yarn. And unless there's some significant bleeding, I'll go ahead and finish up rinsing it a couple more times and then hang it up to dry. If there is significant bleeding, what you can do is add some vinegar to your rinse water. As you can see, there's a little bit of dye coming out. But I could add some vinegar to the rinse water and let it soak for about 20 minutes and then continue the rinse process. For the second skein of yarn, I'm going to change the technique a little bit, and I'm still going to do a extremely low immersion. This one skein of yarn is in this cake pan with approximately 4 cups of water and 2 tablespoons of vinegar. So we have a high acid content, and I'm just going to then sprinkle it with my different sugar sprinkles. I started off with a Wilton's black, which really isn't a true black. It's more of like a very, very dark blue-green. But because of the high acid content and the addition of heat already, that color is going to strike and not break very much. Now I'm adding that brown color, and I am crossing some of these colors over into the other areas so that you'll see some black specks in the brown and brown specks in the black. Next, I'm adding green. And again, crossing over into the other areas, just to add small dusting there. Next, I'm going to be going into the brighter colors, starting with red. Now, because this is in, the yarn is very wet, these sprinkles are going to bleed a bit and create more of a wash of color, as well as having some distinct specks. Next up is orange. And again, I'm adding a little bit of these colors over into the other stripes as well. And then the final color is yellow. And again, adding just a little bit of those yellow specks throughout that skein of yarn. I'm now going to finish up by adding a few more specks of the other colors throughout the skein of yarn to finish this process. With speckling done on this side of the yarn, I'm going to heat set it for about 15 minutes and then flip it. It's been about 15 minutes. As you can see, it is steamy. I'm going to check a little bit for the dye being taken up, and I'm not seeing any color in the pan. So I'm going to go ahead and flip the yarn. I'm really happy to see that there has been some penetration of the color onto the bottom, or that other side of the yarn. So I'm going to arrange this yarn back in the pan, and then repeat that speckling process on this side of the yarn. With this side of the yarn also speckled, I will let it sit for around 15 minutes to set this side of the speckles. With this side steam set, I will check and see how the coverage is across the entire skein. It looks like there's some opportunity here for a little bit more color to be added in some areas. So I do have some sprinkles left, so I'm going to go ahead and add those into the areas where there seem to be no color having been applied. With the last of my sugar sprinkles added, I'm going to go ahead and allow this skein of yarn to finish heat setting this color onto the fiber. When that is done, I will turn off the burners and allow it to cool in the pan before rinsing it. This skein of yarn is now cool and is ready to be rinsed. And look at those colors that have come out on this skein. It looks really nice. I'm rinsing it in some cool water to get out any potential color granules, the sugar, and the vinegar that was in the yarn. Because of there was a lot of sugar in this, so it needs to be washed pretty well to get rid of that sugar. Initially, it doesn't look like there's any bleeding, so the color is definitely set in the yarn. So now I'm going to add a little bit of clear dish soap. Sometimes adding the detergent will initialize some bleeding in the yarn. If the bleeding is extensive, you can again re-soak the yarn in a vinegar water bath, and if necessary, even pop it into the microwave and reheat it to help set that color. At this point, I don't think that there's a lot of bleeding from this skein. I think there might be a little bit of color coming out, but it's really, really light. So I think I'm just going to go ahead and rinse the rinse the soap out of this skein of yarn, rinse it a couple more times until the water comes clear, and then hang it up to dry. Here are my skeins of yarn drying in my closet. You can see that my reusable zip ties double as a hanger for my yarn as it dries in my closet. It'll take probably overnight for this to dry, and so I'll check back on it in the morning. So as a reminder, here's our inspiration photo, Autumn in the Flint Hills. And here's how our skeins turned out. I have to say I am in love with both of these skeins of yarn. These detail shots of this first skein of yarn can really show the sharp speckles of color on the backdrop of that brownish tan base. For me, this skein really has captured the mood that I get when I look at that autumn in the Flint Hills picture. The second skein of yarn also gives off a very strong autumnal feel. You can see in the detailed pictures how the wash of color that was gained by the speckles hitting the water, as well as sharp speckles of the various colors, really help achieve that fall feeling. I'm absolutely thrilled with how these two skeins of yarn turned out. It really felt like what it must be like to use professional powdered acid dyes on yarn. I will definitely be using this technique again as I continue to use food color, but I'm really getting interested in making that leap into the professional dyes and seeing what I can create with those. But for now, I'm going to stick with my food coloring and continue to see what I can create with these simple tools in my kitchen. Thank you so much for watching this episode of GreatScott Knitting Dyes Yarn. If you have enjoyed this video, click the thumbs up, and if you want to see more content, click subscribe, and also click on the little bell icon to get notifications of new content. If you want, please add a comment. Let me know what you think of this particular method, and ask questions or give me ideas for other content. Thanks for watching, and enjoy your knitting.